Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hey, I'm nothing but consistent, right? So for this lecture, we're going to be starting talking about the nation state and the Industrial Revolution. We're going to look at the origins of the nation state. We're going to look at the Enlightenment. We're going to talk about philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and how they viewed government and the nature of man, or man in its natural state. For those of you guys who are doing political science or philosophy, I apologize ahead of time. I'm going to be doing a bare bones sort of look at Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and them. But it's still important because the Enlightenment is going to provide some of the ideological underpinnings to some of the political ideas that the Europeans are going to be taking with them when they go to colonize or set up their empires. So let's get things started with the magical share screen. All right, so once again, there we go. So once again, key terms, hard words. I will have both of these PowerPoints on your courses, so you will have access to the key terms and hard words outside of just these videos. But to give you guys an idea, so we're going to look at the origins of the nation state first, and I've split this up into two areas. We're going to look at the early Enlightenment, 17th century, that is the 1600s. We're going to look at Hobbes, we're going to look at Locke, and then the later Enlightenment, we're going to look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778. So I'm not going to be talking about the two major revolutions happening in this period. That's the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, French Revolution, 1789 to 1799. But rather, I'm going to be talking about some of the major ideas that provide some of the ideological underpinnings of these revolutions and the creation of the modern nation states. So first and foremost, early Enlightenment, let's look at Locke. There we go. A little bit of humor. Hobbes, Calvin is a kid, Hobbes is a tiger, and if you've ever watched the TV show Lost, we have Locke. All right, so let's look at Thomas Hobbes first. Now, Hobbes, we're looking 1588 to 1679. He was born in 1588 in England, same year as the Spanish Armada. Hobbes will spend his early years living in England, attending school, graduating at the age of 20 from Oxford. Schooling's a little different back then than it is now, so don't feel like, oh my God, I need to get graduated. Little different. Now, from there, Hobbes will become the tutor for a prominent family, the Cavendish, Cavendish, and that family has it's a vassal. It's a person who has a prominent place under the king. So in this case, he's the Duke of Devonshire. And the Cavendish family will become Hobbes's primary patron. As tutor, so basically he was the live-in teacher almost of the Cavendish family. And so he would accompany the younger William Cavendish on a grand tour of Europe in 1610. Now, a grand tour is this thing that many sons of the nobility are expected to go on, even up through the 19th and early 20th century, as it shifts down to a middle class idea. Grand tour is this idea that the child should go on a grand tour of Europe, going to the various major cities, Rome, Paris, Milan, Moscow, Bonn, Berlin, and get the cultural influences of the tour. So it's sort of like a gap year almost for these kids. But for Hobbes, he accompanied William Cavendish on the Grand Tour of Europe in 1610, where Hobbes is going to be exposed to a number of continental influences. Now, obviously, as the kids grow up, you need less, you don't really need as much of a tutor. And so between 1620 and 1637, Hobbes will spend his time between living in Paris and living in England, where he would increasingly shift away from being a tutor and be more of a philosopher, moving into philosophy. Hobbes will return to England in 1637, and he'll find his country increasingly divided between the growing sides of Parliament on the one hand and the monarchy on the other, before he leaves for Paris once again in 1640. So again, we're looking, he's going to be very, very much influenced by the English Civil War. Hobbes will be a supporter of the monarchy, and in Paris, he will find himself in good stead when the royal family, just prior to the execution of Charles II, will make its way to Paris. And Hobbes will find himself once again being a tutor, T-U-T-O-R, this time for the future King Charles II. Oh, pardon me. For Hobbes, it will be his experience and his views on the English Civil War that will influence his political philosophy. Now, I'm going to talk about two key works by Hobbes that lays out his political philosophy. De Cive, The Citizen, that's published in 1642. And then we have Leviathan, or the matter, form, and power of a commonwealth, ecclesiastical and civil. You guys can just remember it as the Leviathan, published in 1651. But first, before we get to his magnum opus, Leviathan, we need to talk about De Cive, The Citizen, published in 1642. And in this work, Hobbes is going to, well, he's going to look back and like any good philosopher, any good historian, you're going to want to sort of set yourself up against the greats. And for Hobbes, he is setting himself apart from one of the pillars of Greek philosophy, Aristotle. Now, Aristotle argued that man is naturally inclined towards living in a society. For Aristotle, man in his natural state is a social being and inclined towards living in a society. For Aristotle, that's this idea of the polis, P-O-L-I-S. Now, Hobbes disagrees with this and argues that human nature, man in his natural state, is selfish. That is, man will naturally denigrate, bring down, and naturally compete against others. And their passions will magnify the value that they place on their own interests. So human nature is selfish. And man will naturally bring down another man to bring himself up or compete with others. And the ego, the selfishness of man in his natural state magnifies their own interests over others. The example I always use is for Hobbes, man in his natural state is like a 3-year-old. If you ever had a toddler, babysat a toddler, had younger nieces and nephews, cousins, brothers, sisters, and dealt with a toddler or 3 or 4-year-old, they focus on their own interest. They want a ball, they go over, they take it. If somebody says, hey, that's my ball, they will hit the person and then take the ball anyway. To me, that's the best analogy for how Hobbes feels human nature in De Cive is at its core level. So for Hobbes, competition or war is more natural to man than accommodation. Competition is more natural than creating a common political order. Man is naturally going to butt heads with one another, interest versus interest, both of them thinking their interest trumps the other, rather than coming together in society. Now, when we get to the Leviathan, 1651. This Leviathan, or the matter, form, and power of a commonwealth ecclesiastical and civil, to use its full name, is an expansion of some of the ideas that Hobbes has been working on for the previous decade. The Leviathan is going to be Hobbes's magnum opus. It's going to be his masterpiece. Now remember, according to Hobbes, the state of nature is one in which there is no enforceable criteria of right or wrong. There is no enforceable criteria of what is right or what is wrong. For Hobbes, in human nature, might makes right. If you can enforce your criteria of right or wrong, that's what it is, until somebody else enforces their criteria of what is right or wrong. Each person took for himself all that he could. Again, human nature is selfish. And according to Hobbes, human life was, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So again, remember, human nature is selfish. So there's no enforceable criteria of what is right or what is wrong. So if that's right, why is there a society then? Why do people come together? Well, Hobbes will latch on to this idea of a social contract. Now, it's going to be Rousseau, who we will talk about later, that really developed this idea of social contract theory. But we're going to find in Hobbes, we're going to find in Locke elements of this social contract. And so for Hobbes, the only way to bring humanity out of this brutal, short, vicious state of nature was to agree to delegate the judgment of what is best for oneself to someone else. That is, in this case, a sovereign. There'll be that position right there, the sovereign. Now, no enforceable criteria of right or wrong might makes right, human nature as a 3-year-old. Why would people come together and say, okay, I'm going to give the right to govern myself to somebody else? Why would somebody do that? Well, it's this idea that, again, might makes right, and if you have more people together, a group is stronger than an individual. In essence, everyone comes together and agrees to transfer the right to govern oneself to the sovereign. And in exchange, they hope, it's not a guarantee, but a hope that the sovereign will provide physical safety and a modicum of well-being. So in exchange for giving up the right to govern oneself, human beings are hoping to get security back. Those who do not choose to engage in this transfer, those who stay outside of what is becoming a society, will find themselves weaker vis-a-vis the group as a whole. And so they would find themselves at a disadvantage in the competition to meet their needs: food, clothing, shelter, typical human needs. And so you might be strong individually by yourself, but a group competing against against the big strong man is more likely to accumulate more food, more clothing, more shelter, more security than the individual. So the individual says, if I'm the sovereign, Mark, I agree to give up the right to govern myself, and in exchange, I really, really hope you protect me and allow me to have some modicum of well-being. Now, once this right of governing oneself is transferred, the right of the sovereign to govern is absolute. The right of the sovereign to make the decision of what is best for the society is absolute. But Hobbes puts in a bit of a caveat. Hobbes puts in a bit of an unless. So the right of the sovereign to make decisions is absolute, unless the many feel, the group feels that their lives would be threatened by submitting to this. So the sovereign, the ruler, has the legal right to decide unless the decisions are making the group as a whole less safe. And then you can take back your right to rule. You can decide someone else is a sovereign. So what is the role of the sovereign in society? Well, property rights. The sovereign determines who owns what, whether it's land, whether it's goats, what have you. The sovereign determines who has the legal right to own what. The sovereign can determine who can or who will hold public office for government. The sovereign determines how the economy will be run, how the economy will be regulated. As well, on a legal level, the sovereign decides what acts are illegal and what are the punishments for these acts. In essence, in this version of society, the sovereign is the supreme interpreter of law, decides what is right, what is wrong legally. The sovereign is the supreme interpreter of scripture, decides what is orthodox, what is right by scripture, what is right by the Bible, and what is heterodox, what is not right by the Bible. And the sovereign is the supreme commander of the army. It's important to note that the sovereign is not a party to this social contract, but rather receives obedience from everybody in the hope that the sovereign will provide for safety and provide for well-being. So again, this idea of the social contract is making a group more powerful by coming together and giving over their right to govern to someone else, the sovereign. And the right of the rights of the sovereign is absolute unless the group feels that their lives will be threatened by submitting to the sovereign. The sovereign is the supreme interpreter of law, the supreme interpreter of scripture, the supreme commander of the army. The sovereign determines who owns what, who can run for office, who can hold office, how the economy is run, what's legal, what's illegal, what's right by scripture, what's wrong by scripture. But the sovereign is not party to this contract. It's not a legally binding contract in the sense that there's an obligation on the sovereign side, but rather it's a hope that the sovereign will provide safety, the hope that the sovereign will provide well-being. The sovereign, in theory, will act in the best interests of the many over the interests of the few. That doesn't always happen, but in theory, according to Hobbes in Leviathan. The sovereign will act in the best interests of many over the interests of the few. So, thinking back to the English Civil War from the previous lecture, we can sort of see the royalist, the monarchist ideas that Hobbes is having. In his mind, well, the Stuarts, Charles I, James I, James I and Charles I, sorry, they did nothing wrong. They were acting like the sovereign. They were acting in the best interests of all. And so, according to Hobbes, well, the sovereign, the power of the sovereign is absolute. So that's a rundown of Thomas Hobbes. And again, I apologize to anybody who's taking philosophy or political science. I'm just doing a bare bones skim to give everybody sort of an idea of what sort of ideas that are coming out of Europe when people go to South Asia or China or the Middle East, what sort of ideas they're bringing with them. So we have Hobbes, 1588 to 1679. And another key philosopher in the early Enlightenment is John Locke, 1632 to 1704. Now, Locke was born to Puritan parents. Locke's father fought on the side of Oliver Cromwell, fought on the side of parliamentarians during the English Civil War. Like Hobbes, Locke went to Oxford and fostered political connection through the people he met there. For Locke, his primary patron will be Lord Cooper, Cooper. Lord Cooper, the first Earl of Shaftesbury, Shaftesbury. You don't need to know the patron, I'm just spelling it out for you guys. But Lord Cooper was one of the most powerful English politicians of the 1660s and 1670s. So while Hobbes's major political viewpoint will be shaped by the English Civil War, Locke will be shaped more by the events surrounding the Glorious Revolution in 1688. And with Locke, the area the work I want to focus on is his major work, the two treatises on government, published in 1690. And while Locke published works prior to this, two treatises on government in 1690 would be his major work on political philosophy. When we think of Locke, one phrase comes to the forefront: the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. These three, the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to property, will be the foundation of natural law according to Locke. Now, let's talk, just like we did with Hobbes, let's talk about how Locke viewed man in his natural state. Now, according to Locke, man in his natural state is naturally free and equal. Everybody is naturally free, naturally equal, under the law of nature, under this idea of natural law. And the only being that man in his natural state is subject to is the will of a, quote, infinitely wise maker. You could read that as God, but for Locke, he uses the term infinitely wise maker. Now, in this state of nature, every person is required to enforce as well as obey the laws of nature: life, liberty, property. Now, there is a possibility of violence, there is a possibility of abuse with this idea that everybody is able to enforce the law. Humans, therefore, will enter into a contract with each other to recognize by a common consent. So people come together to recognize by common consent a government that will enforce the law of nature amongst its citizens, amongst the citizens of that state. So the role of government is to enforce the natural law. So kind of like how some people give up the right to govern themselves under Hobbes to the sovereign. Individuals will give up their right to enforce natural law to a government so that it enforces the natural law for everyone. So these people would not enter into this social contract to give up their liberty in exchange for security, as we see with Hobbes, but rather they give up some of their liberty to provide for a civil government empowered to protect private property. So civil government enforces the natural law of liberty. Now, Thomas Jefferson will sort of bastardize Hobbes. He will talk about the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For Locke, Jefferson will bastardize Locke. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. For Locke, the emphasis is on life, liberty, and property. So the right to life, everybody has the right to his or her own life. The right to liberty, everybody can do what they want up to and until it infringes on the liberty of someone else. But let's talk a little bit deeper about property, because one of Locke's big ideas that provide the foundation of his version of a social contract is the idea of property. Now, each person has a property of his or her own person. That is, each person owns his or her or their own body. And therefore, other people may not use a person's body without his, her, or their consent or permission. Here we have the natural right to life. Now, so people own their own body. Now, once man starts mixing their own labor, which the man owns because he owns their own body, once man starts mixing labor with the outside world, then that man acquires the right to the fruits of that work. And you might be scratching your head and be going, huh? So in essence, by mixing your labor with the outside world, you create property and therefore acquire the right to that property. To give you an example, so if I have a hatchet, if I have an axe, and I go down to Wascana Park and I start chopping down some trees and I start making a log cabin. Because I'm taking my labor, which I own because I own my body, and applying it to the outside world, the trees in Wascana Park, and I make a log cabin, then the product of my labor, that is the log cabin, becomes my property. So that, in essence, is a natural right to property. People gain property by mixing their labor with the outside world in the natural state. Now, it's important to note that Locke was against the hoarding of surplus production. That is, I can't go out and chop trees and make 10 log cabins and say, or 7 log cabins and say, aha, I'm living in a different log cabin for each day of the week. That would be surplus production, and I would be hoarding that. Locke believed that man should share his surplus with those less fortunate, and that God has, quote, given the world to men in common, to make use of to the best advantage of life and convenience. That is, the world is everybody's. And so I cannot hoard something that God has given to everybody. So even if I build 7 log cabins, I would be morally obligated to help out those who are less fortunate. So we have the right to life. Again, you own your own body. We have the right to liberty. You can do with your body whatever you want up until it starts affecting someone else's own liberty. And we have the right to property. Using your labor on the outside world, you're earning that property. So we could sort of see how Hobbes and Locke are in coming from things in 2 different perspectives. Government forms for Hobbes because people are giving up their liberty in exchange for the hope of security, the hope for protection, the hope for well-being, and the sovereign has supreme power. For Locke, people are giving up the right to enforce the natural law, a little bit of their liberty, to determine a common government by common consent that determines basically what is right and what is wrong. But it's by common consent. The members of the community decide what is right, what is wrong, and the government is there to enforce that. To give you a bit of a more concrete example, how the idea of Hobbes and the idea of Locke found themselves competing in the real world, we have the ideological underpinnings of the American Revolution. Now, when it comes to the American Revolution, Parliament believed in a more Hobbesian worldview and had an idea of what was called virtual representation. There we go. Virtual representation. Now, in the colonies with the American Revolution, big thing was this idea of no taxation without representation. And there was a big to-do about Parliament passing taxation laws without the consent of the governed, that is, the colonists in the American colonies. Parliament argued that even though the colonies were not directly represented in Parliament, there was no member of Parliament from Virginia, there was no member of Parliament from Jamaica, there was no member of Parliament from Massachusetts. Parliament acted in the best interest of the empire as a whole. In other words, Parliament argued they were acting as the, quote, sovereign of the English Empire. We are acting in the best interest of everyone. And therefore, the American colonies were being virtually represented in Parliament. Yes, you did not have real representation, but you had virtual representation because Parliament's acting in your best interest. Now, the 13 colonies, they took a more Lockean view of things and argued Parliament is no longer protecting our property, they're no longer protecting the fruits of our labor, and therefore, Parliament was no longer their legitimate government. Took a little while for them to sort of break away from the idea of still being ruled by a king, but Parliament was no longer their legitimate government, and therefore the rebellion that occurred was a legitimate rebellion. So this idea of virtual representation is this idea going back to the Leviathan, going back to Hobbes and this idea of a sovereign acting in the best interest of everyone. 13 colonies said, no, 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 no. You're not protecting our property anymore. You're not protecting the fruits of our labor anymore. Therefore, you are no longer our legitimate government. So for the later Enlightenment, I'm going to focus in on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778. There we go. Now with Rousseau, we're going to focus in on two of his works. Just ignore the Smith part. We're just going to focus on Rousseau. We're going to focus in on two of his works. We're going to focus in on the discourse on the origin and basis of inequality between men. Just know it as the discourse on inequality, published in 1754. And then we have of the social contract or principles of political right, otherwise known as the social contract, published in 1762. In both of these works, in Discourse on Inequality and on the Social Contract, Rousseau is going to dialogue with some of the ideas that Hobbes and Locke were both talking about. So first, the Discourse on Inequality, published in 1754. In this work, Rousseau looks at human nature, just like Hobbes did, just like Locke did, and discusses the rise of inequality in human society. Now, Rousseau will point out two very different types of inequality: natural inequality and artificial inequality. Natural inequality is inequality created by nature. For example, I'm not a very tall man. IB, however, is a very tall man and could probably dunk a basketball on me. Therefore, he has a natural, I have a natural inequality towards IB. So a natural inequality is one created by nature. One person may be physically stronger, one may be smarter, or naturally more witty or intelligent than another, and therefore we have an inequality created by nature. Artificial inequality, easy for me to say, is an inequality created by man and society. So think about this the current day. We have this current concept of the glass ceiling. The fact that women can only be promoted so far in society before they start banging their head against an invisible ceiling. That's an inequality created by man and society. So we have two types of inequality. We have natural inequality and we have artificial inequality. Now, let's look a little bit at Rousseau and his view of man in the natural state or human nature. Now, unlike Hobbes, Rousseau had a more positive view of human nature, or had a more positive view of man in the natural state, and yet he had a more pessimistic view of society. So Rousseau is kind of an interesting beast. He has a more positive view of human nature, but yet a pessimistic view of society. Now, for Rousseau, man in his natural state was not a social being, similar to what Hobbes believed. Like Hobbes' original man, Rousseau believed that man in the natural state is not a social being. But whereas Hobbes said life is short, brutal, it's all about competition, all about war, Rousseau believed that man in his natural state was healthy, happy, good, and free. And he argued what Rousseau did, what separates man from animals was the capability for choice, that is free will. You're not beholden to your natural impulses. You can make decisions. You have free will to decide. You have the capability of choice. Hell, everybody watching this in the class is exhibiting this capability of choice. You chose one way or another. You made the conscious choice to come to university, and I appreciate it. So one thing that separates man from animals is the capability of choice. Another thing that separates man from animals is the quality of compassion. For lack of a better term, empathy. Empathy allows man to interact with his fellow man. I see somebody crying or upset on a park bench. As an empathetic person, as someone with compassion, I'm going to go over there and see if everything's all right or how can I help. Empathy is at its core this idea of trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes. So compassion, empathy is another thing that separates man from animals. So we have the capability of choice, that is free will. We have the quality of compassion or empathy, allowing man to interact with his fellow man. And then we have the last thing that Rousseau believes that separates man from animals, the quality of perfectibility. This idea that you can always make yourself a little better. And so this is what drives man to always try to improve his physical conditions. Again, we are all doing this right now within the classroom. We are trying to make ourselves better. And Rousseau would say, look at the caveman. He sees his family wet and tired with no shelter, or with just leaves as shelter. He's feeling empathetic towards his fellow man. So he makes the choice to go out and look for better shelter. And so he finds a cave, an empty cave, thank goodness, brings his family there, and then starts building a barrier in front of the cave to prevent wind and rain from coming in. He's trying to improve his physical conditions. That's what separates, according to Rousseau, man from animals. The problem for Rousseau is he sees man in his natural state as the highest form of being. But as man engages in society, vice, sin, keeps coming in and starts dragging man further and further and further down, becoming more corrupted from his natural state. And so this brings us to property. And so man in his natural state, according to Rousseau, is a solitary creature. But once they engage in society, for Rousseau, once man cohabitates with woman, once man starts interacting with their neighbors, man starts the gradual slide towards inequality. And it's going to be the introduction of property, because the introduction of property will mark a further step towards inequality, because once you have property, you have to decide, again, who owns what. And so property makes it necessary for men to institute law, to institute government in order to protect property. This is a very Lockean view of the social contract. So again, Rousseau is dialoguing with both Hobbes and Locke at various points and at various levels. Civil society, as Rousseau describes it, serves two purposes: to provide peace for everyone, again, a very Hobbesian view of things. You give up liberty for security. So to provide peace, to provide security for everyone. But secondly, civil society serves a purpose, serves to protect the right to property for anyone lucky enough to have possessions. So a very Lockean view of things. Government's there to ensure property rights. So it's going to be civil society that will create these artificial inequalities based on who has property, the rich, versus who does not, everyone else. So in Discourse on Inequality, Rousseau's trying to talk about, where does inequality come from? His second work, and the work that pretty much more people might have more than a passing familiarity with, is The Social Contract, published in 1762. And in this, Rousseau will expand on some of the ideas he just touched upon in Discourse on Inequality. Now that he's identified what the sources of inequality are, Rousseau's asking the question, how does man create a political community in the face of a commercial society? We have a commercial society where everybody's buying and selling and everything. In the face of this, how does man create a political community? And one of the key ideas that Rousseau identifies in The Social Contract is this idea of popular sovereignty. Sovereignty is, in essence, the right to rule. That's a good shorthand for it. And so whereas Hobbes will place all the power, the right to rule, in the hands of an all-powerful sovereign. You gave me all the power, you fools. Hobbes places all the power in the hands of an all-powerful sovereign, that it's a monarch. Rousseau will place the power, the right to rule, in the hands of the people. Now, this is where it's going to get a little fuzzy. According to Rousseau, man goes along with natural law. Man has all the rights accorded to him by law: the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to property. But upon entering a political community, he surrenders these rights to a general will. A general will that expresses the desire of the society. And it's not it's more of an essence. It's more of an expression of feeling rather than a solid general will. And this general will, acting through the political community, expressed through the political community. The political association, the political community will express this general will, hence government. And it will act in the best interests of society. But for Rousseau, unlike Hobbes, unlike Locke, man has the option of withdrawing from the social contract when and if they choose so. Although withdrawing from the social contract during a time of national crisis, for example, can be considered desertion. So therefore, when we talk about Rousseau and social contracts, a social contract for Rousseau is one that must be willingly entered into. Man must choose to be part of society. That can be expressed in obeying laws. That could be expressed in saying, I choose to go along with the society. But it's also a social contract that could be willingly left. You can decide to leave this social contract. So I talked about the general will and how it's expressed through the political process, i.e. the government. So on the other side of the coin, and separate from the general will, is the government. I mean, think about it like your brain versus your body. Your brain makes a decision, your body enacts that decision. Oftentimes it is very split second. I decide to scratch my head, I decide to snap my finger. My body reacts. The general will is, and so on the other side of the coin and separate from the general will is the government. The government is one formed by the people. Remember, popular sovereignty. The right to rule is at the hands of the people. The people express that right to rule through government. And government is designed to apply the general will to society. Now, government is made up of people. And sometimes people act in their own interests. And so when government exceeds the general will, the popular sovereignty, then the government becomes illegitimate and it is required to be abolished. All right, so let's stop sharing. Boop. So that is the political philosophy part of the nation state. In the next part of the lecture, we're going to look at the early industrial revolution and talk a little bit more about why it happened, say, in Europe rather than elsewhere. All right, I'm going to let you guys go here. Go forth, slay dragons, and I will see you in the next video. All right, bye.